It's this part in The Lord of the Rings, Sméagol's journey. Sméagol, later known as Gollum, was born in the year 2430 of the Third Age. Hobbits derive from three different ancestral groups, the Stores, Harfoots, and Falahides. And Sméagol belonged to the Stores. On Sméagol's 33rd birthday in the year 2463, he was fishing with his cousin Sméagol. And during that time, Sméagol found the One Ring. And something snapped within Sméagol. He forcibly took the ring, killing Sméagol and starting his journey down the road where he would eventually become Gollum. The ring immediately corrupted Gollum, and he used it to commit crimes, to steal, and to do things maliciously to others. Over time, he developed into an individual that became unliked and shunned by his people, even so much that they kicked him and he bit their feet. And eventually, after 7 years, he ends up leaving and going into the wild and then into the Misty Mountains, where he would stay for almost 500 years. Then, in the year 2941, Bilbo, during the adventures of the Hobbit within the Misty Mountains, finds the ring, and of course escapes from Gollum by using the ring. Going back just a little bit, Sméagol was actually given the name Gollum whenever he began to lose his mind over the effects of the ring and made a gurgling or an odd sound from his mouth. And because of that, it states that they started to call him Gollum. After Gollum loses the ring, he leaves the Misty Mountains and spends 77 years searching for that one ring. During that time, he was captured by Sauron's forces and made to reveal that the one thing that he knew about the current owner of the ring was that his name was Baggins. In the year 3017, Aragorn, during the hunt for Gollum, captured Gollum and took him to Thranduil and brought him back to Mirkwood. After being captured by Aragorn and brought to Thranduil and Mirkwood, Gandalf interrogated Gollum and found out that Gollum had revealed that Baggins had the ring. This, of course, played a role in the urgency and sense of need of Frodo to leave the Shire with the ring. So let's fast forward to the time of the breaking of the Fellowship, the year 3019, February 26th. Just 4 days later, on March 1st, they capture Gollum, and Gollum becomes their guide. But he's only their guide for 12 days before he ends up betraying them at Shelob's lair. So that was only a 12-day period of time where you see the changes of Gollum going back and forth between Sméagol and then back to Gollum. And for me, I guess that's one thing that I just wanted to highlight going through all that backstory. When Frodo chose to have pity rather than violence towards Sméagol or Gollum, Frodo reminded Gollum of who he really was, or at least who he used to be at one point in time, that being Sméagol. And for me personally, I like to think of this being a little bit of a respite that Gollum had, or Sméagol had, from all of the terrible, horrible things that he had experienced from finding the ring. Again, he did a terrible thing in how he obtained the ring, and then he continued to do terrible things with the ring, and then he lived in isolation in the Misty Mountains for almost 500 years, and then from that point in time, searching to be back with that ring again. But for this small period of time, it would have been about a week before they were found by Faramir's men, meaning perhaps for a week, Sméagol had friends again for the first time in over 500 years. And to me, that's a beautiful story. There are differences between the movie and the book of how that occurs and his descent back into becoming Gollum. In the books, there's no violence or anything to that effect that occurs to Gollum by Faramir and his men like there is in the movies. However, Gollum still feels betrayed in the books because his master turned him over or turned him into Faramir's men. And so that part is similar. However, the extremity of Faramir and his men's actions towards Gollum is different. And then, of course, that sense of betrayal that he felt both in the movie and in the book led him to betray Frodo there at Shelob's lair in Cirith Ungol. Lastly, we know what happens at the very end of the story whenever Frodo gets to Mount Doom and then decides ultimately not to destroy the ring, and then fights with Gollum over the ring, and then Gollum seizes the ring and then falls to his doom there with the ring. One last thing that I would like to discuss is what potentially occurred to Gollum after what happened with the destruction of the ring. We learn, at least in Tolkien's works, that what happens to men, and hobbits were more directly related to men than any other creature within Tolkien's works. Well, what happens to men after they die is unknown, even to the Valar. But Iluvatar does know what happens to them. And what happens to them is described as being a gift. And so I guess perhaps through rose-colored glasses that I may have, this individual that was tortured and had gone through so much, a lot had to do with his own actions and choices. However, he suffered much because of the ring. Before finding the ring, Sméagol is described as being curious and inquisitive and a little bit odd. but not evil. And unfortunately, whenever he does find the ring, it immediately corrupts him, and then it sets him on this trajectory of almost 600 years of pain and anguish. And I do realize that he did do a lot of bad things, and ultimately he does lose his life in pursuit of that ring. But through rose-colored glasses, I just can't help but to think at that point in time, he finally had peace. Just as Gandalf had described as him playing a part or having a role in the greater scheme of what would occur with the ring, Gandalf was right. And Sméagol played one of the largest roles in the destruction of the ring. I wonder, at least in the fictional landscape of Tolkien's world, if Sméagol was able to finally have some peace. Not stating that someone should do something so extreme to have peace that way, not saying that. But I guess just in framing the final events of Gollum's life and then what had potentially occurred afterwards, perhaps after all of that, he was able to have some peace with some knowledge that he contributed and played a role in destroying the one thing that brought him so much pain and so much agony, and also playing a role in the destruction of the Dark Lord Sauron. Not sure if any of that makes sense, but at least that's just some thoughts that I have on just trying to provide a positive insight on how his story came to an end within the pages of The Lord of the Rings. And then taking a step back and learning from his life and his story and how that could be applied into my life or perhaps even yours. I think that it's vitally important for us to try to stay away from things that we know could be detrimental or harmful to us. Or if we ever do find ourselves getting into an area where that's starting to happen in our lives, to try to make an abrupt about face and to not be afraid or scared to reach out for help if you need help in trying to overcome whatever it is that is bringing you down. Number two, I think that we can learn some positivity from Frodo's interaction during that 12-day period where Gollum was his guide. Instead of tearing Gollum down, he tried to help remind Gollum of who he was. And again, I like to think, at least for just a small moment, Sméagol knew what it was like to have a friend again after living a life alone and in torture for centuries. And I think that's something that we can do in our own lives. Again, I'm pretty big on boundaries. I'm not telling you not to have those. However, if we could come from a place of kindness and understanding as we deal with those that are going through something that we might not be able to completely comprehend. And again, we might have to place boundaries there, but from our boundary, we might be able to extend kindness and to try to have within our hearts an empathy and realizing that they must be going through something terrible that has brought them to such a low point. Not trying to justify horrible things people might do, but people make choices and decisions that lead them into a way that they just spiral and get out of control. And if we could do something to help just bring them back, I think that's a beautiful thing. And so those are just some things that I think that we might be able to glean from the life of Sméagol, which is a tragic tale, but I think there's some good that we can find despite the sadness in his life.